Every record has been falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every street renamed. And the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Demonization of India's medieval history, painted Muslim and barbaric, calls to mind Orwell's idea of the Ministry of Truth, but the Hindutva version. These ideas of persecution of native Hindus at the hands of invading Muslims, destruction of Indian culture, and plundering of wealth, all motivated by religious bigotry, stem from the Hindu nationalist discourse in India. Now mainstream and dominant, the core of this discourse is the polarizing binary of Hindu versus Muslim. From this emerges political discourse.
औरंगजेब के अत्याचार, उसके आतंक का इतिहास साक्षी है.
Popular culture.
टीपू सुल्तान ने सैकड़ों हिंदू मंदिरों को ध्वस्त किया और हजारों लोगों का धर्मांतरण किया, यह दावा किया जाता है. ये क्यों नहीं पढ़ाया गया हमें?
औरंगजेब ने अपने शासनकाल में भारत के लोगों पर बहुत अत्याचार किया और भारत को कई वर्षों तक खूब लूटा. वो एक लुटेरा
that invokes the ghost of past wrongs for present political gains.
हमारे इतिहास को गौरवमय तरीके से लिखने में अब हमें कौन रोकता है? हमें पुरुषार्थ करना चाहिए.
And so we must question the weaponization of history and ask ourselves, how do we understand history writing? Why is it important to know who writes history and why? And what are the dangers of politicizing history? This video is a collaboration between Hatebusters and Nows, a website committed to debunking anti-Muslim hate speech and promoting positive, accurate news about Muslims and Islam. Its ultimate aim is to foster a just and inclusive society where diverse communities coexist peacefully. To achieve this, the website offers a comprehensive toolbox including a debunking hate section with well-researched articles backed by references, an eye-opener section highlighting uplifting stories that dispel misinformation, a library for accessing books, and a media section for finding videos, all rigorously verified and sourced. Visit hatebusters.in and join in the fight against hateful propaganda and Islamophobia, and help in creating a more inclusive and understanding world. With that in mind, let's now get back to the video, The Myth of the Muslim Invader. Historians like Eric Hobsbawm are famously critical of nationalism and its use and misuse of history. They argue that the nation-state rests on a certain mystification of a collective past. It is a product of modernity that didn't always exist, and as an imagined community, it necessitates a certain manipulation of history to justify itself. Majoritarian nationalism takes this to the extreme. And so you have a Hindu nationalism in the contemporary Indian context that needs the narrative of an evil Muslim past to legitimize its current politics and power. What has helped this majoritarian discourse in India is colonial history. Categorization of Indian history into Hindu and Muslim segments was a colonial project. It was James Mill, a British historian, who wrote the first modern history of India. He neatly periodized it into an ancient Hindu period, a medieval Muslim period, and a modern British period. Interestingly, British and not Christian. Such European writings on Asian history were heavily influenced by Orientalism, instead of being based on historical investigations. Mill maintained that the Hindu and the Muslim were two distinctly separate nations in India and constantly in conflict. This periodization deeply colored the interpretations of Indian history and the religious nationalisms born out of the subcontinent. Historical evidence, however, shows that history is complex and messy, and that categorization can never be so neat. This periodization has been discarded by historians because to use the explanation of religion as the prime cause of all major historical activity is factually incorrect. Yes, Indian history is very much about persecution and conflict between different groups of people, much like history everywhere. In fact, kingship and violence are so deeply intertwined that you have the Arthashastras from ancient India legitimizing violence. And so to reduce it only to religious antagonism is simplistic to say the least. Firstly, to begin with, Hindu-Muslim identities as understood today didn't exist in medieval India. Pre-modern India was a caste society. The indigenous people of the subcontinent did not use the term Hindu for themselves. They used identities of caste and dynasty. Neither were the Muslims identified as Muslims. Instead, they were referred to as Tajikas or Turushkas, or clubbed with those who were considered outside of the caste system, that is, Mlech. And within this caste society, there existed violence and conflict that predated the coming of Muslims. Social groups who had access to power and wealth, that is, the upper caste, victimized those social groups who didn't have this power and wealth, that is, the lower castes. Most importantly, the subcontinent was never a single consolidated Hindu nation in pre-modern India. It was an amalgamation of multiple sovereign kingdoms constantly in conflict with one another. So when the Muslims came to the subcontinent, it was not understood as a collective of Muslims coming to attack a collective of Hindus. Rather, they were referred to as another competing force in Sanskrit records. Tajikas and Turushkas are mentioned alongside other communities such as Tomaras, Pandyas or Cholas as warring social groups. Therefore, the popular imagery of Muslims invading India and enslaving Hindus is far from the actual complexity of medieval India. First interactions between them on the Indian subcontinent was through trade along the west coast of India. Trade meant an intermingling of cultures. So you had examples of Arab traders settling here and marrying locally that led to some new social identities emerging. And you had examples of Muslim appointees in administrative offices of Hindu kings. Romila Thapar cites the example of a Rashtrakuta king who appointed an Arab governor in the region of Sanjan, coastal Deccan. Like there were some Muslims working under Hindu kings, you had Hindu royal families who retained their administrative statuses under Muslim rulers. The Mughals famously had Rajputs appointed to high offices. Raja Todarmal, one of the Navratnas in Akbar's court, was a premier noble entrusted with the Mughal economy. Another example of a Hindu chief in a Mughal court was Bundela Raja, Bir Singh Deo, who held one of the highest mansabs in Jahangir's court. Retaining local persons in administrative roles was a politically strategic measure to maintain stronger control over local matters, which shows that Hindu-Muslim relations were determined by many factors other than religious affiliations. Another good example that Thapar cites is the Battle of Haldi Ghati between the Mughals and the Rajputs. You had a Rajput leading the Mughal army, Raja Man Singh of Amber, and you had an Afghan commander on the other side, Hakim Khan Suri, who led Maharana Pratap's army. Can you then call it a Hindu versus Muslim confrontation motivated by religious hostility? Or a political conflict between two groups vying for power and land? Speaking of explicit destruction of temples, there is no doubt that temples were desecrated under Muslim rulers. What historians contend over is whether it was driven solely by religious bigotry or state interests. Temples were centers of power in medieval India, associated with wealth and authority. As centers of power, they were places of actual and potential political opposition. So rulers like Aurangzeb did destroy temples, but Aurangzeb also protected temples, depending on political loyalty. Audrey argues that generally temples were destroyed in the aftermath of political rebellions and to forestall future uprisings, not out of bigotry. And pre-modern temple destruction was not unique to Muslim rulers. Remember the multiple warring kingdoms in the subcontinent? Different kingdoms had different sovereign deities. There is a historical record of a Chola king who sacked another Shiva temple in the Pala kingdom of Bengal and carted off its central image as war trophy, 3 years before Mahmud of Ghazni attacked Somnath. Or you have the 11th century record of Hindu kings ransacking temples long before Muslims ever entered the subcontinent. There are also records of Hindu kings destroying Buddhist and Jain religious sites. Another important consideration to be kept in mind is that the historical records of Muslim destruction of temples came from Persian and Turkish chronicles that were written as eulogies about Muslim rulers. Focusing on invasions and conquests, these records had a tendency to exaggerate and sometimes even glorify acts of temple destruction that have no mention in other contemporary evidence. Aurangzeb, who is often singled out in contemporary public discourse as the most cruel Muslim king in Indian history, had more Hindus in his imperial administration than any other Mughal ruler before him. Existing records suggest that while temples were destroyed under him, they were also patronized. In fact, there are records of Aurangzeb issuing farmans to protect temples, grant lands to Hindu communities, and provide stipends to Hindu spiritual figures. Such patronage can be understood as politically strategic measures to consolidate power or kinship, and not necessarily for religious reasons. Francois Bernier, a French historian who spent time in the Mughal court in close proximity to Aurangzeb, described him as accommodating of Hindu practices. But despite all of this, claims of Aurangzeb's barbarity are ubiquitous. Audrey attributes such misguided interpretations of history to modern anti-Muslim biases in contemporary India. Aurangzeb is a villain not because of India's past, but because of India's present. Using this lens to search for historical wrongs is antithetical to history writing, which should be based on evidence and analysis, not unfounded assumptions. There can be competing interpretations of history, but they must be backed with historical evidence. Richard Eaton describes history writing as a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. Evidence is often incomplete and sometimes even contradictory, but that doesn't mean that you can fill up blank spaces with pieces that do not exist. The use of explicitly false narratives for political ends can be best exemplified with the recent case of Tipu Sultan and the 2023 Karnataka State Assembly elections. Tipu Sultan is another Muslim ruler who was demonized as a Hindu-hating fanatic by Hindutva ideologues. In the recent run-up to the assembly elections in the state, a narrative that was popularized by BJP leaders was the story of two warriors from the Vokkalega community killing Tipu Sultan. The idea was to portray it as two Hindu warriors bravely killing a Muslim despot and thereby winning the support of an electorally significant community. Except, there is no historical record of the existence of these two warriors. Far from being a Hindu hater, Tipu Sultan was a consistent patron of many Hindu temples and mats. There are records of him restoring a temple destroyed by the Marathas. His top advisor was a Brahmin, and there exist letters by Tipu seeking the blessings of Hindu religious leaders. What he is most well known for is fiercely fighting the British in 4 Anglo-Mysore wars and finally dying, according to historical evidence, in the battlefield defending his capital, Srirangapatnam. Intercommunity relations in medieval India have been both amicable and conflictual. There are events of violent antagonisms, but also examples of harmonious coexistence and cultural exchange. But when a narrative exclusively focuses on violence, and only a certain kind of violence is talked about and not others, and when historians are trolled and there are calls for bans, it is evident that such popular history, if it can be called history at all, has vested interests. And what makes such divisive propaganda so popular, despite historical discrepancies, is deep-seated communal prejudice in India today. There's an emotional subscription to what V.S. Naipaul called a wounded civilization. He held that centuries of Muslim rule was responsible for civilizational vandalism of the subcontinent. Except that a single Hindu or Indian culture never really existed in pre-modern India. This narrative, instead, is undergirded by modern anti-Muslim sentiments. It seeks to justify avenging or correcting historical injustice and plays into the idea of a Hindu nation where Muslim rulers are inherently illegitimate and by extension, Muslim citizens too today. And so this historical propaganda is not just bad history, wherein nuances are ironed out and modern anxieties are projected onto the past. It is also dangerous, for it holds the potential to justify violence and hate today.